It is Tuesday, January 2nd, 2019. So we're glad you can join us. This particular broadcast, this particular episode for me is kind of a passion project. It's something that I believe in fundamentally. It's something that guides me. If you're new to the evoke process, some of the concepts might be feel a little bit metaphorical, a little bit abstract, but hopefully over time as you participate in these broadcasts, either on the webinar version or through our podcast, that they will make sense after a while. And I'll say this comes more from my experience in working in therapeutic programming, but also being a client myself for the last 20 years consistently, and throughout my life, probably for about 30 years. And so while my formal education, gave me a foundation of knowledge and awareness and tools and skills and theory and exposure to research, it really has been my experience that has brought me to this point to be able to give this broadcast tonight. So I hope it's helpful. You can submit questions all throughout the broadcast. Alex, who's moderating for me tonight, will submit them to me throughout the broadcast, and there'll be a specific time at the end for question and answer. This particular broadcast seeks to explore the relationship between therapy, insight, and how we change. What causes someone to change, and what does it mean to be a self? D.W. Winnicott, famous psychologist, introduced the concept of the true self, also understood as the real self or the authentic self or the vulnerable self. The true self was contrasted against the false self and the pseudo self or the perfect self. When I was thinking about this today, I was reminded again of the quote by Carl Jung, where he said, "I would rather be whole than good." It's this idea that if who we are poses a threat, causes those in our early context to be upset, worried, anxious, frustrated, rejecting of us, that we tend to want to show up in a way that will get us that connection, that acceptance, that approval. And so we essentially sacrifice the true self, the authentic self, for the greater need, which is connection and belonging. And so for a lot of us, we realize that as we go through life, that we have to kind of get rid of some of the ideas that we have. We have to get rid of some of the fear and some of the guilt and to do battle with it so that we can develop this authentic self. And it's a subtle process. And there's a lot of dichotomies and dialectical ideas in there, things that seem to be the opposite, but that aren't. So this is our starting point from this evening. I hear that the ideas start to be fairly dense. Let me talk about the idea of a self. I've thought about this lately in response to the epidemic of young people hurting themselves, self-medicating through addictions, and also trying or successfully committing suicide over the past several years. And in part of what I've read, part of what I've seen in my own practice is this idea that sometimes the pressure and the self-esteem that's tied to that, the depression and anxiety that is tied to that, comes from this place that the child thinks they need to be a certain thing. They need to show up a certain way to get acceptance, to get approval from others in their life. And that if we can shift the goal from helping them to be a successful student, an accomplished person, to being a self, then we do a lot of things to inoculate them against those kinds of forces of depression, anxiety, and the things that lead to self-harm and self-injury. So helping a child develop a self. So I talk about the self a lot. It's really who you are. And it's that simple. What does it mean to be you? It's really uncomplicated at its core, right? It seems complicated because we ask ourselves, how should I be? We take others' reactions to us as some kind of evidence about our rightness or wrongness. In other words, if I'm trying to have a conversation with you, the thing that gets in the way of me just telling you the simple truth about what I feel, what I think, is the wiring that's in my head that says, if you react to me with some kind of upset, with frustration, with anxiety, with defensiveness, then I walk away from that interaction thinking something's wrong with me. So in some ways, it's very uncomplicated because it's just the truth about what we feel and what we think. And even this is very important, especially as we think about our children. Even if what we think or feel or imagine is somehow irrational, in some previous context, it makes perfect sense. In some part of our story, that feeling, that idea, that belief makes perfect sense. And it becomes the work in therapy, right, to uncover that. And that's where the healing happens, is when we find the original context. Motives are confusing or are not confusing or hidden when we're talking about ourselves, right? They're exposed. You're not driven by unconscious motives or dilemmas. There's an old saying in Al-Anon that says, if it's historical, it's hysterical. So when we have an up-regulated, an anxious response to something that some people, maybe even us, think it's out of proportion to the situation at hand, that means that there's something historical in there. This happens all the time in our relationships. And we usually end up reducing the dynamic to arguing to other people about the validity or the logic of our response instead of kind of exploring where it came from and remaining curious about ourselves and or about the other person when they're having that reaction. A self is kind of the evidence of what we think, feel, want, know, believe, preferred, like, dislike, and so on, right? It could be as simple as the fact that I don't like mushrooms, or as profound as something like I value honesty above all. It could be my preference for a political party or religion. It could be my fear and anxiety around spiders, right? That's who I am. There are no shoulds in an authentic self, right? Speaking in absolutes, there's no shoulds. There's no what I should do. It's just who I am. I'm just scared. I'm just frustrated. I'm just angry, right? Again, there are layers and depth to that emotional response to things that we can explore and become more and more aware of. And the deeper that we go, again, the more simple it all becomes. There's no need to be good or right. I think one of the biggest barriers, and this is I think a very sometimes confusing idea that I talk about all the time. One of the biggest barriers to being an effective parent, right, is the need to be a good parent. Because if I have a need to be a good parent, anything you do that in my mind is evidence of me not being a good parent is something that's going to be threatening to me, and I'm going to want you to get rid of that. That could be from something as obvious as making a mistake or getting in trouble with drugs, the law, school, right? If that reflects on me, if I need to be good in my mind or in my culture, right, my community, then I'm going to be threatened by that, and you're going to be punished for that. But even more maybe insidious than that, it doesn't give a lot of space for you as my child to be angry or sad or frustrated or disappointed. I'm going to have very little tolerance for those feelings because I need to be good. And needing to be good and right is the opposite of an environment in a home where people just to get to be a self. So many clients over the years have tried to justify to me their feelings, their choices, their beliefs. And what I say to them often is, you don't have to justify it. You can just feel that way or think that way. But see, they didn't grow up in a soup, in a context where that was okay just to be a self. They had to be right, right? Everybody in their context was fighting for who was right instead of you can be different, you can feel differently, you can feel something completely crazy, and it's met with curiosity and openness and empathy rather than judgment. And it doesn't seem so apparent, right? Because it's more subtle. It's somebody coming home from school and feeling disappointed or sad, and a parent trying to talk them out of it. It's somebody being frustrated with their partner or their parent or their child and being told that in some way that frustration doesn't make sense. That if they just had more information, if they just understood it differently, they wouldn't feel that way. So it's much, much more subtle than we imagine. When there's a healthy self environment, there's no need to have others like, agree, or endorse you and in the way of your being, right? I make this joke often at our intensive programs that we run for individuals and families in Park City, Utah. I make this joke that one of the pieces of evidence that I relate to that tells me that this is true and happening so much of the time is it's very difficult for me, and I see it with lots of people. It's very difficult to have, for example, a dislike of food. Like for me, it's mushrooms, without people trying to talk me into it, right? You can barely taste it. Or, you know what, if you've had them sauteed, they're wonderful. Or I think they just add flavor. And so if I'm not even allowed to not like mushrooms, I'm a 50-year-old man. If I'm not even allowed to say what my preference is about mushrooms, how much must that be going on in our lives? I had a friend say to me not too long ago, it was kind of waking up to the therapeutic ideas that we're talking about tonight. And he said, Brad, I'm struggling a lot in my life because so many times around people that are my friends, when I tell them how I feel and what I think, I find them trying to talk me out of it or tell me that my thinking, my feeling is not okay. And I responded to this friend and I said, I'm so glad you're seeing it. It's happening so much of the time. I can sit in a restaurant. This is not a therapeutic setting. I can sit in a restaurant. I can sit at the community pool. I can be walking in a grocery store and I can hear on a daily basis people not allowing someone else to feel or think what they feel and think because it's threatening to them. A self is honest, courageous, empathic, authentic, and many other things, right? They're active, they're not passive. There's a real absence of guilt or shame to drive this person, right? Although some people make what they think is an important distinction between guilt and shame, I don't. It just is unnecessary. Shame might be more intense and fundamental and core to the person, why guilt is more about behaviors. But when you have a healthy self, you're not motivated by guilt. You're motivated by love. You're not motivated by fear. You're motivated by love, right? You have it to give. And guilt comes from a place where we were all taught that when our parents were upset or proud of us, disappointed or proud of us, we were led to believe that that meant something about us. And it wasn't necessarily true. It wasn't true of us as children, and it's not true of our children, right? We can all think of examples in the parent-child relationship or other relationships where somebody would feel guilt while doing the right thing. The right thing being honest, courageous, kind. We can think of that. And so this idea that guilt can be sometimes, we kind of put it over to the side and it can be a motivator that helps us to do good. It's toxic, it's dangerous, it's not dependable. And it's not required. In fact, it's not present in higher levels of moral development. It's not present at all. Kind, loving, generous, and patient, respectful, right? This idea of self-psychology, people sometimes, pop psychologists or lay people think that it's kind of this self-centeredness, right? I will tell you that people that practice healthy self-care are often, almost always, accused of being selfish. But healthy self-care is kind, it's generous, it's giving, it's loving, it's respectful, it's courageous, like I said before. You have something to give, not for anything that you get back, but it's a going out thing. It's similar to the idea that I talked about, that loving and needing are not the same thing. In fact, in some ways, they're exactly the opposite. Loving is giving, and needing is taking. They're not right or wrong. They're just different. And you can need somebody and love them, but don't confuse the two. And many times, many of us do this. I think it's this idea about selflessness. And I wrote in my book, when you attempt to act as a selfless parent, you create an unhealthy dynamic in which you must get your needs met through your child. When you parent in this way, you are using your child rather than connecting with her. When you don't value yourself, then you don't model self-care and self-worth for your child. If you're a selfless parent, where's the space for your child to be angry with you? A great deal of guilt can grow within a child if a parent needs to be completely selfless. So there's what I think is not only inaccurate, but inappropriate and harmful, this idea that selflessness, it might be semantics, of course, but this idea of being selfless is something to aspire to. A healthy self in a parent is the foundation of a child learning empathy, a child being required to understand other in their lives. It's also the foundation of a parent respecting, having boundaries. I never think about, when I do this parent education, I don't talk about the things that we do, like boundaries here or there, rules here or there. I don't think about those as the thing that makes a difference in parenting. What I think about is the development of self in the parent and all that that implies, and how then they show up in the relationship with the child, and how they then are capable of seeing and holding the self in the child, right? So boundaries aren't the solution. They can be evidence of a healthy self. They are evidence of a healthy self, but they in themselves are not the solution, because like any tool, you can take a hammer, which is a wonderful tool, and you can kill somebody with it. You can hit them over the head. You can break a window. You can do something destructive with it. So the tool doesn't do the thing. It just can be used in the service of, or be evidence of, a healthy self in a relationship. I'm a big fan of insight. I love insight. I love how it feels. I'm seduced by it in my clients sometimes. I'm really impressed by it. I overvalue it at times. It's a part of what happens, but I want to talk about it. It's real limited place in this whole concept. It's an awareness of what we are feeling and why. It's awareness of what causes behavior, right? What drives us. When somebody develops insight and you say to them, why are you being sarcastic, or why you seem a little bit cold, or you seem mad, or you seem frustrated, they get curious. They ask themselves questions. They're able to identify it. And if they're developing courage around that, they tell the truth, even if the truth isn't well received. Insight can be new tools, right? New ways of thinking about something. I've heard this a few times. If I knew better, I would do better. I don't always think that's true, right? If I did everything that I knew up here as a parent educator and therapist, and I've been studying this for 30 years, in practice for almost 30 years, I would be pretty impressive, actually, because this is what I dedicate my life to. But I actually am more aware of the mistakes that I make every day because of my emotional limitations, right? So it's not, insight can help, but it doesn't do everything. We're still going to have to be willing to fight against the wiring, the guilt, and the fear that is embedded in us, that is hardwired in us, that says, like Joseph Campbell teaches, the philosopher teaches, if I say or do this thing honestly, authentically, courageously, I'm risking something fantastic for that, right? I'm risking rejection, isolation, alienation, unacceptance. So it can help, but still in therapy, what I've learned is for myself and my clients is you still have to walk into discomfort. You still have to walk into the dark room, into the cave, right? Campbell says, the cave that we fear to enter holds the treasure that we seek. We have to walk into that. I hear this phrase about she has the best of intentions. And this isn't a judgmental response, but I'm not sure that that's as true as we often think. I was working with a young man recently, and he was describing an interaction with his parents and how they were struggling and inadvertently shaming and guilting him, and they had a lot of anxiety, a lot of codependency. He was just describing the dynamic. And he said, I know my parents have the best of intentions. And I said, hold on just a second. I'm not sure that that's true. Do I think they love you? Yes. Would they step in front of a bus for you? I don't doubt it. They would take a bullet for you. But really what they're doing is they're trying to manage their anxiety through you, right? They're trying to sort out their fear by focusing on you changing, by managing you. You know, the secret ingredient I recently wrote in loving somebody is not the feeling of warmth or affection. That's not the secret ingredient. The secret ingredient is courage, being willing to look inside of ourselves and find out the impediments, the barriers that get in the way of loving, of growing, challenging ourselves. That's what love is, the ingredient in love. That's what Gandhi talks about when he says that a coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It's only the prerogative of the brave. That's what he means. So again, it's not a judgmental questioning someone's intentions on a surface level. It's realizing that if somebody loves, it looks like capacity. It looks like strength. It looks like empathy, curiosity. It looks like healthy self-care, first and foremost. When a person in a family develops more insight, when they begin to awaken, other members of the family will often say things like, they're overreacting, they're too sensitive, they're being crazy, or they are crazy, right? That's what a person hears when they start to wake up and start to notice things that others in the family haven't woken up to yet. So you'll go through this phase. Some of you have already experienced this as you've been pulled into this work, into this world, by the problems that your children are struggling with. You start to have an experience where you realize the old conversations, the old ways of thinking, the old sensibility, the old you in essence, doesn't make sense anymore. And some of the conversations that you were having with friends and family before start to make less and less sense. I want to talk about enlightenment because it relates to insight, right? It's kind of a bigger, broader, deeper way to talk about insight. I love this quote. Make no mistake about it, enlightenment is a destructive process. It has nothing to do with becoming better or being happier. Enlightenment is the crumbling away of untruth. It's seeing through the facade of pretense. It's the complete eradication of everything we imagine to be true. Enlightenment makes friends with the darkness that's in us, right? That's what Jung was talking about when he said, I'd rather be whole than good. That's what Jung and Freud are talking about when they talk about dealing with the darkness inside. As I thought about the idea of enlightenment, these are three concepts that I've come up with that are kind of the pillars for enlightenment. And of course, we're all on the path somewhere. The first one is to be okay with being wrong and get good at losing. When you get good at losing, you can be wrong, you can apologize, you can have empathy. Don't hear me say that means that you don't have boundaries. Just the opposite. Just the opposite. See, if I'm okay being wrong, then I'm just willing to be me. Here's my limit. Here's my boundary. Here's as far as I can go, and I'm sorry, and I might be wrong. I was coaching a father this summer in the wilderness program, and what his son was trying to very respectfully and in a kind tone of voice negotiate with his father the terms of treatment. And I could see the father's pain, and I said, can I kind of role play with you what you might say? And the father said yes, and the son was willing. And I said, I love you. I'm worried about you. And the way that it was going at home wasn't okay. You weren't getting what you needed. And I'm not willing to go back with it. And I might be wrong, but this is my best guess. And sometimes I stay up at night wondering if I'm doing the wrong thing. I don't know for a fact. I'm listening to people that I respect and trust, and I'm making the decision that's in my heart. And I look back at the father because I was talking to the son, kind of playing the role of the father, and tears were coming down his face because he said that's absolutely true. He had enough self-doubt to go around for all of us in this process. And if he had done what was his natural instinct, which is most of our natural instinct, he would have tried to prove to his son why he was right and why it was deserved. He wouldn't have given space for his son to feel and feel the things that he felt and thought. Right? He wouldn't have, and it would have all been born out of a lack of confidence and sense of security, and the erroneous belief that the fragile foundation that most of us grow up in, and most of us reinforce, that it's about being right instead of being a self. Number 2, come to know your darkness and remain on speaking terms with your mental illness. I think about mental health and illness as a continuum, right, that we're all on. There's this idea that you're either mentally ill or you're mentally healthy, and that's ridiculous. There are, of course, diagnostic and clinical markers that where you cross a certain threshold and you qualify for a diagnosis, but all of us deal with some anxiety, some more than others and some less than others, and depression, right? And we could go through the list of diagnoses and behaviors, and we fall somewhere on the continuum. But enlightenment means I know my wounds and I know how they show up, and I'm talking to them. I'm having conversations with my insecurity, and I have a great sense about where it came from. And again, it doesn't abdicate the responsibility that I have. It doesn't require me to abdicate the responsibility that I have for my decisions and for the consequences and for going forward. Just the opposite. It empowers me, right? I can be accountable because I realize I'm flawed and I'm on speaking terms with those flaws. So they're not a threat. There's a quote I love that I read recently that says, when you admit to your faults, nobody can use them against you. And then so many people have the exact opposite instinct, right? We spend our lives trying to prove to everybody, to our children even, that we're getting it right, that we know what we're doing. And so again, we develop this context where it's about who's right and who's wrong instead of just me. I'm not comfortable with alcohol in the home, right? I'm just not. In this relationship, whatever it is, I'm not comfortable with this. That's what it sounds like when somebody speaks as a self, and they are more assertive. Instead of trying to convince the other person to change so you don't have to set a boundary. Number 3 of the 3 keys to enlightenment that I came up with, learn how to die again and again. Context, ideas, circumstances, and people, right? We can't stay stagnant. We have to be willing to question old ideas, old contexts, old relationships even. If we grow, we're going to outgrow some of those circumstances and people. And enlightened ones are on that journey. And they realize that life is a series of goodbyes and rebirths in the process. I wanted to talk a little bit about psychoeducation. It's what I do. It's what I'm doing right now. And the idea that I think it becomes overvalued because it appeals to our conscious mind, right? It appeals to our to the part of our brain, the highest part of our brain, where we think about if we knew better, we would do better. And so the idea is that it can be a part, or it can be an impetus towards change. It can be a part of change. It can be the outcome of change, what we know, right? Our education, but it's not the same thing. It can add information where there's ignorance, if that's just the problem, and sometimes it is. A famous psychologist said one time that a lot of people develop what he called pseudo-stupidity, meaning that they're not missing a lack of information. There's something characterological, emotional, that's deeper, that's missing in the person. But sometimes it's just information. But that's less than we imagine, because most of the stuff that is driving us is unconscious and subconscious, right? Most of it is outside of the frame of our awareness, but it can be a part of it. On top of growth, it can help the person with instituting new ways of being, new tools, new skills. It's not everything, but it's something. J.D. Gill wrote in her book, Finding Human, especially with regard to emotional matters, this description may not be the most effective route to take. Here, it may be preferable to evoke the emotion or experience. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I'll tell a story to illustrate it. I'll use a metaphor, of course, or I'll invite somebody into an experience, because describing it consciously, it bumps up right against the defense, right? We have to have it pulled out of us. This is part of why we call our program Evoke Therapy Programs, is this idea that we're pulling out of people the truth that is buried. We're not giving it to them, right? We're not handing it over to them, but we're just helping them to discover it. We're helping them remove the impediments, the ideas, the beliefs, the feelings that get in the way of knowing it. And then they discover it, and they tell us the truth about themselves. I want to talk about confrontation a little bit. A lot of people imagine that a large part of therapy is confrontation. I thought that early on in my career when I was younger, for sure. Many people, clients, think that that's how people learn. And intimidation or fear or shame can be a powerful motivator. So people believe that in some ways is positive growth. I read a headline from an article today in the news, didn't go into it, but it said studies show that successful women had nagging mothers. And to tell you the truth, some of my most effective employees in their work habits have a lot of shame and a lot of fear. It's true. But that's not the business of developing self. And if the measure of successful is academic performance, we know, because of the autobiographies and biographies of some of the most talented people that have ever existed. We know that they lived in a fear-driven, self-hating world. We know that about people. And yes, they may have become great golfers or tennis players or artists or business people. They didn't have a healthy and healed self. Confrontation, in the sense that I'm talking about nowadays, the way I think about it, it's responding with a different and unique response. And it took me many years to figure this out as a client. I originally thought that my therapist thought I was too fragile to confront me, that I couldn't take it. That's what I thought. Year after year in my early work, I thought that of her. I thought that that's what she thought of me. And she would explain over and over again, I'm just trying to understand you. And it didn't sink in for many years. I thought it was important work. I hear people say, I love him or her because he or she calls me on my crap. I hear that from couples. And again, if we live in a shame-based environment, if all we're looking at is outcomes, sometimes that can be helpful. But if we're looking at enlightenment and personal growth and developing a healthy and authentic self, those things don't tend to go in that direction. The one thing that I consistently confront people on, I always find this ironic, almost humorous, is the idea that confrontation is not a useful tool. I can't tell you. I'll have some clients ask me it many, many times about confrontation. And I'll teach them why I don't think it's valuable. In essence, I'm saying to them, the one thing I'm going to confront is your belief that confrontation is useful. And they have the exact response that I expect them to have, which is, you don't get it. You don't understand. It takes time for the client or the child or the adult to see and understand the value of being heard. They will experience a transformation that comes from being understood, that ultimately leads to the ability to develop a stronger sense of self. And all the symptoms that we want reduced to go away, all the problems that we see will transform over time, but it takes a while. Think about the therapist's object. Somebody just shared this with me in an email recently after reading one of my blogs about what to look for in a therapist. If we have an adequate therapist or a therapeutic experience, we will eventually internalize the therapist and we will have a copy of them that we refer to carry around inside of us as we go through our journey in life. It's more automatic to me now, but for many years I've had the thought, how would Jamie, that's my therapist's name, how would Jamie respond to me in this situation? How would they respond to this situation? I have clients of Evoke talk about that all the time. After listening to hours of these broadcasts, will say, what would Brad say in this situation? Right? I'm just passing on what Jamie did for me. And when I've thanked her for what she's done, she says the same thing to me. She says, I'm just trying to do for you what somebody else did for me, which is to empathically understand you so that you might heal from the wounds that cause these issues in your life. That you might have the patience and the compassion toward yourself that I model so that you can look at them. Instead of just hating yourself for the symptoms that you display, you can actually grieve, hurt, feel, and move through it. This is a kind of a dense idea, so I wrote it out. In my way of thinking, therapy is not a problem-solving endeavor, although problems are addressed and resolution is discovered in the context of therapeutic work. Rather, therapy is a process of discovering the true nature of oneself. In order to do this, we must remove the barriers that prevent this awareness, such as shame, fear, and guilt. In order to do this, we must experience the context of an empathic other. This experience of sitting in the presence of an empathic other must occur over an extended period of time. The reason is because our defenses are so ingrained and unconscious that removing them to uncover the truth that lies beneath must be earned over time. We take small risks as we show up in therapy, little by little, at the risk of what had happened in our past, in countless and powerfully performative contexts before, that might happen again. And that same reaction when it doesn't occur, in the cases where we find an adequate therapist, we slowly learn to trust that we can be our authentic selves without the risk of rejection or psychological annihilation. It's this idea that the hardest part of therapy is to show up and tell the truth. And we have every reason not to. Our past has told us that that was dangerous. When I think about participants in our wilderness program, we do give them an experience. It's more important than the therapy. The therapy helps, but we give them an experience that is being in a safe context. I think about the context as the therapist's or the parent's mind. So we shift the context dramatically. We introduce them to their work and their project. It doesn't get solved while they're with us, but hopefully we change the trajectory. We change the family's trajectory, the family's frame, the family's way of being with each other, the way that the parents can feel about things and hear things and see things. We give them tools, skill, insight, and education for sure. We take them on a journey. It's like a story. We support the family in changing and supporting change, right? My goal is that you guys experience as much joy and change in this process as you awaken, but that also gives you a capacity to be there for your children in a much more profound and capable way. We find our clients and understand them. We don't try to fix them. But finding them and understanding them leads to fixing, leads to healing. We don't reduce them to symptoms. The symptoms, again, are evidence. They're the breadcrumbs that we follow back home to find the wound, but they're not the thing. They're just the voice of the thing, and we have to be able to hear it. And we leave an empathic imprint. Clients say it is the staff that made the biggest difference in my wilderness therapy experience. Research again and again and again. And we have great outcomes. But it's the people that have a different way of seeing them. And I want to pause here to make this clear. It's not that we're all toxic parents. It's just that we have something wrapped up in all of this. Other people can do this for my children better than I can at times, a lot of the time. My identity is overlapping with my children. I have all of these issues that I've described. That's why I know them. It's not because I read a book about it or somebody taught me about it. It's because I found it in myself. And so then I can see it in other people. I love this quote by James Hollis. He said, transformation is about enlargement, and enlargement generally comes from suffering. That's what we're all doing. That's what your children have pulled you into. So how do you get there? People ask me that all the time. We'll have a wonderful session, a wonderful discussion. How do you get there? Have an experience. Not experiential therapy necessarily, although we do that, but have an experience. You walk into a therapy session. You walk into a support group. You can start with just spending time on these broadcasts because this is anonymous. You can listen to this type of thinking. In essence, you're in the presence of an empathic, understanding other for this hour, once or twice a week, reading a self-help book. You spend time in the presence of somebody who thinks like this. So many of my clients have said when I'm talking about this with them, my young people that I work with, they say, nobody thinks this way, what you're saying. And that's so telling. And I say, I know it seems like it, but there are actually some people who think this way, who aren't disappointed or proud of you, who just see you, who don't need you to be a certain way so that they're okay, but they practice their own self-care, who don't need you to do something or not do something so that they're happy. They make happiness their responsibility so that when they show up to you, they can be there for you. There are people that won't be proud of you if you get into Harvard or disappointed in you if you become, something much less than that academically. And they will look at me in the eyes and say, nobody thinks like this. As sincerely and confidently as possible. I remember saying that to my therapist almost 20 years ago, and she had a similar response to me. I thought she was being ridiculous or suggesting something to challenge me when she said that it didn't matter to her how I was, who I was, how successful or much of a failure, how stupid or smart my decisions were, on and on and on. And that I could be loved regardless of any of that. I was writing this weekend about the quote from Gandhi that he says in, the elders of the city, not Gandhi, excuse me, Kahlil Gibran, the elders of the city and then the poem about good and evil came to him and said, tell us about good and evil. And he says in the midst of that story, that poem, he says, you are good in countless ways. And when you are not good, you are not evil. You're just wounded, acting out, in need of love and connection. And we know that the people that need love and connection are the hardest ones to give it to. That's why we do this work and develop more capacity, because our children need more than the average child because they're struggling. That's what they're telling us. So we develop more and more capacity. My capacity is much more than it was 20, 30 years ago. With my clients, with my children, it's still nowhere near complete or whole, but it's much broader, much deeper than it used to be. So we walk into a therapy session, we walk into a 12-step group to a support group, spend time with an empathic other, spending time with somebody with a new way of thinking. That's what the books and education, podcasts, webinars can be about. Healthy attachment in parenting is a really, really, really fundamental experience. And what we know about healthy attachment versus unhealthy attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, is we know what it does to the brain. We know that what it does to the individual child, how they grow and how they develop. We know what it does. And we also know that when people have had fractures in that attachment or trauma, we know that it can heal or restore them. Really, I'm talking about resilience when I talk about self. I'm talking about a brain that is not in fight or flight mode, doesn't have a trauma response. I'm talking about a brain, a person, a self that feels safe to be who they are. That when they're hungry, they eat. When they're not, they don't. When they're tired, they sleep. When they're not, they don't. When they have something to give, they give it. When they're empty, they ask for help. Right? It's simple. It's beautiful in its simplicity. Many think therapy is a place that you go to hear difficult things, but I think the real difficulty is in saying difficult things at the risk that the therapist may respond in ways similar to prior contexts. That's the difficulty. Contexts are a big thing. This at Evoke Therapy, this idea, this conversation that we're having right now, can be a different context. Trying to introduce you to a different context, and we're trying to give your children a different context. Gil says in Finding Human, in this process, I will experience a bit of what it's like to be beyond myself. That is, I will experience how to look at myself, not how to look at myself, but how I look to another. When my story is told back to me, if that telling is empathic and accurate enough, I'll be able to see why it is a limited story of a limited existence. I will, in essence, begin to have a sense of that story in its wider context. I will, in an important way, be the I'm sorry for the typos. Be the fish who experiences the not water. I'll be the fish who experiences the not water, and so is able to have a different sense of what water is. So what are the take homes? It takes time. It takes an experience. Insight can help, psychoeducation tools can help, but it's having a different experience that shapes us differently. And we have to participate in it. We have to feel fear, feel guilt, feel shame. I always say if I'm not feeling some guilt, I know I'm not challenging myself with healthy, authentic self-care. It can't be explained exactly because the recipient has to experience some of it. You know, as a therapist, if you take one step too far, what it's like when a therapist says something to a client that they're not ready to hear. What the clients will say is, have the experience of is, you don't get me. That's what it will feel like. That doesn't fit. That doesn't make sense. And sometimes the therapist is off, right? And sometimes they're not. But the client hasn't discovered yet, isn't ready for it, and the defenses are well in place, well intact. It's partly a feeling, like I said, and the behavior can be evidence of it, but it's a way of being. It's a sensibility. It's a way of being in the world and in relationship to those that are in it, starting with our children. It's the task of the parent and the child to develop a self, to have an experience. Being a real self is the most important ingredient in supporting the development of the real self in a child. Immerse yourself, surround yourself, expose yourself to others who understand what it means to be an authentic self. Hear it at Al-Anon, hear it at AA. Have an adequate therapist who isn't trying to fix you, but is trying to understand you, who doesn't need you to show up in a certain way for them to be okay and to feel good about themselves as a therapist, to get rid of their own sense of inadequacy when you're not making the progress that you should be making. And then transformation requires time and experience and suffering, like Hollis talks about. Pain, grief, feeling. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions. You said rather than Harvard, something that might be less academic. That is my son, but I think it is something much different than academic. Isn't it more accurate to say something much different than academic? What I was saying was, yes, it could be in several different spheres of life. I was just using the academic experience, like you can become a PhD from Harvard, or you can work on the grounds crew at a football stadium. Something less what the world would say is successful. I could also equate it to money. I could also equate it to being a great artist versus not being a great artist, being a great singer versus not being a great singer. It's changing the frame from success is accomplishments in any area of life to success is being an authentic, courageous, kind, loving, giving, grounded self. All right, we'll take a minute and go over announcements, then I'll get back to the questions. We would like all parents, while their children are with us, to attend a support group, at least 6 while your children are with us. We have here listed Al-Anon, Codependence Anonymous, or Families Anonymous. You can go Google those and find meetings in your area or near where you live. We ask you to go to 6, to try at least 6 times. Another option is refugerecovery.org. If you want an alternative, you can also go to NAMI.org to find classes, education, support that's affordable in your area. The Evoke Family Foundation asked me to announce that they have a Crowdrise campaign going on right now. This is an organization of alumni parents who raise money to help people that can't afford therapy. So if you have some and want to give back, we invite you to donate to them. Those help people get into wilderness therapy programs, not just Evoke, and also other therapeutic services. You can listen to all of our broadcasts on the podcast app on your iPhone, on the SoundCloud app on your Android device, or you can simply go to soundcloud.com and search Evoke Therapy Programs. On Twitter and Instagram, you can follow us for inspiring content, stories, and links with the name @Evoke Therapy. On Facebook, you can search Evoke Therapy Programs. You can also go to the Evoke Family Foundation on Facebook. Our blog, the Evoke Therapy blog, has new content each week. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. If you are a current parent, we ask you to go to a workshop if you possibly can. The next one in Utah is January 12th through 13th. And then in February, it'll be in Oregon, February 16th through 17th. So talk to your Evoke therapist and find out which one might be right for you. And you can combine that with a visit to see your child if the therapist and you decide that it's the right time. Contact Melanie at evoketherapy.com for more information on our workshops or to RSVP. If you want to come to an intensive, if you want to do a deep dive into your work, I'm going to be running the one on January 20th. Claire Madison is going to be running the one on February 20th. Contact intensives at evoketherapy.com. I think we still have an opening in our January intensive. Love to have you, love to see you. I believe in this work. If you really want to do a deep dive, a therapy accelerator, I call it, or a springboard if you're new to it, these are amazing. I do it every year for myself. My children have done it. My wife has done it. My business partners do it. So I really believe in this stuff. Parent support groups. Michael Griffin will be in Los Angeles on January 6th. That's a Sunday. I will be in New York City, January 14th. Come out. You can invite friends for an evening of connection, support, and education. Melanie at evoketherapy.com for more information. And then we have our pursuits trips, which are adventure activities for young adults or families. Think therapy light or sober fun, reconnection, therapy recalibration, customizable all over the world, any kind of activity. All right, I'm happy for any other questions. It looks like one has come up. My son has another person walking with him currently, and that and that figure, I believe, is me telling him many of the things you have said that kids shouldn't hear. Any suggestions about how to approach him when he is an adult, 22, is sort of an adult, who harbors still resentment from a court program and from having him picked up in the middle of the night to go to Utah? There's resentment, but also the guilt that he feels because he existed in these programs. Just apologize. I believe in what I do. I believe in Evoke. I believe in the therapeutic programs that I work with. But it's okay to say, I'm sorry if I was wrong, and I want to hear about it, and tell me how it hurt, and really meaningfully understand what it felt like to be woken up in the middle of the night. Don't tell him that he deserved it. Don't tell him to get over it, or he can feel that. You just say, I'm sorry. Maybe I was wrong. And tell me about it. And ironically, if we have that kind of a sensibility with our children, they can move through it. If they feel our agenda to be right, to be recognized for our good intentions, to be justified in our decisions, if they feel any of, or for them to move past it already, if they feel any of those agendas, that agenda, they're much, much more likely to stay stuck. But the point is, you could be wrong. You could be. I could be wrong. And so it's different from a need to be right and a willingness to be wrong and to hear somebody and understand. And the thing that I want you to hear inside of your head when you're apologizing is, from me, and don't ever say this out loud, you did the best you could, and you loved him, and you were worried about his or her decisions, and you thought this would help. And maybe it didn't. Maybe it hurt. Maybe it scared him. But you weren't willing to not do anything. But don't say any of that out loud. You just need to know it. Because the willingness to be wrong comes from a really strong foundation of I'm okay even when I make a mistake. And I will make lots of them. Next question about taking time, experience, and suffering. I have lived this and agree. My question is regarding my 19-year-old son who went to Evoke last year and then 9 months at an aftercare. He is now in a deep depression. I am hiding this view about time and suffering, but I feel I might be enabling him while he was here with me. However, I am not comfortable asking him to go when he is so unwell mentally. He does see this new therapist 2 times per week. Thoughts? It's difficult. It's a difficult question. I'm glad that you asked it. What I would say is there's no answer that I can give you, of course, on this broadcast. I can tell you that the most important contribution to you knowing what you need to know is doing your work. You have a child that lives with you that is depressed. It's not very different than a child who lives with you who's an addict. It's not very different from a child who lives with you who has other mental illness issues. So what does that mean? That means you need more to be able to support them in a way that is connected, healthy, and helpful. And the fact that you don't know makes all the sense in the world. This is not an easy situation. But the answer is in you developing more and more capacity, new eyes, new ears, confidence, that when you decide to keep him, when you decide to ask him to leave, whatever it is, that you do that from a more capable place, a place of clarity, a place of a strong sense of self. And if you go to a therapist, hopefully you'll find an adequate one who won't tell you what to do or give you advice or direction. That would be a disaster. But you'll go to a therapist who will help you find yourself more. And again, I know it sounds quite abstract, but in finding yourself, then you will be more capable of responding in a way that's helpful. That's what the finding yous are about for the parent that come. When they come, they have questions like, what should I do? That's what my book says. It starts off with, what should I do? And I realize, I say in chapter 1, that that's not the right question. The right question is, who am I? Who is my child? What's my relationship to their issues, their struggles? And then out of all of that comes the obvious, the apparent and obvious truth of what should I do? What will I do? Another parent writes, first, thank you for sharing some of these ideas through this webinar. We are now 11 months past the beginning of our Sons of Oak experience. We very much subscribe to these ideas, but it's a real challenge to maintain a new way of being in the everyday jobs we have and need. Interested on your thoughts on this? Yes, you're right. It's hard. This is why I do my own intensives each week. This is why I am in therapy and will be for the foreseeable future. This is why I do the work that I do, because it's hard. And it escapes me each week. And I need to rediscover myself constantly. So just keep the work up. Keep doing it. Excuse me. All right, no further questions. Thank you, folks, for joining us. We had a good crowd tonight. I really appreciate you joining us. Thank you for and on behalf of your children and your loved ones for showing up. And I hope these points of contact are helpful. The next broadcast will be Wednesday, January. I got the dates backward from last week. It will be Tuesday, January 8th. Tuesday, January 8th next week. Family conflict and resolution. I'll talk about problem-solving conflict resolution skills and ideas what family conflict comes from and is born out of, and what are the best ways to find resolution with that while still maintaining your own integrity and your own capacity for your child. Thanks again. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.